We're continuing our conversation with Doctors Harley Nauman and Eric Bailey about alternatives for summer pasture, but also the stocking capacity. How we figure that? So last time we talked about a couple of options being legumes like Korean Lespedeza or sun hemp, but there's other options too for the summer in our sorghums and other grasses.
Sure, there are quite a few options in the grass space. You just mentioned some sorghums. The sorghum Sudan hybrid. Sudan grass is one that's, kind of, I don't know, it was popular a long time ago and then sort of fell out of favor with the hybrids and their popularity, but quite a good option as well. There's pearl millet is another option. There's crabgrass. There's Bermuda grass.
Now, crabgrass I've tried to kill a lot of.
That's right.
Bermuda grass is... we had that in our yard. It wasn't very fun, but they're great forages.
Yeah, right. So, both of those. You hear a lot of people, they kind of bristle at the idea of crabgrass, but the forage varieties, the improved varieties, are fantastic. They can make quite a pretty good amount of tonnage for summer grazing.
Now, I've also often heard though they take nitrogen, and people. That you've got to put enough on it to make it grow. These big tonnages that people talk about.
They'll certainly produce more with nitrogen, but I don't think that it's absolutely necessary that you're putting.
Oh, really?
You don't have to go feed the heck out of them.
Okay.
But it's like any grass, right? You could say that any grass takes nitrogen to be more productive, right? Depends on what you need, depends on what you're trying to get out of it as to whether that pencils out.
Sure. And when would you plant those then?
So crabgrass is kind of an interesting one. We'll just bring that here since we're talking about it right now. It's one that it'll actually germinate really early. The soil temperature of about 56 degrees or so.
Oh,
April,
May.
Yeah, crabgrass will germ. And so it's one that, you could actually seed that pretty early on, and maybe even kind of think about frost seeding crabgrass, and you'll have that show up. But you could seed it in May as well. We've done it multiple ways, early and late, and gotten good stands with it. And it can produce upwards of 3 tons to the acre with some decent, if you get a little bit of rainfall in the summertime. So.
Like everything else, rain's going to make a difference, of course.
Of course. So, that's a pretty good option, I think. I like it.
And good for grazing as well as grazing mostly or for hay production?
I think we tend to talk about crabgrass and grazing systems primarily.
Sure.
Yep. And it's a nice complement to your fescue as well. So if you had them in mixed situations.
So I could overseed my tall fescue then with crabgrass.
Sure. Yep. And I think that's a pretty nice option. Yep. If you're looking for high nutritive value forage, especially.
Sure. And Bermuda grass, maybe a little bit, it's not quite as cold tolerant, just a little bit later.
Not quite as cold tolerant, but there are some, they've made some improvements over the years in cold tolerance in Bermuda grass. And so there are some varieties available that they'll work up here in central Missouri, just fine. They're not going to be as productive as any of those southern, forage varieties, but they'll certainly provide you adequate summer grazing opportunities.
Now, how about our sorghums? They're more like mid-late May planting into June.
Typically, you'll see, mid-late May is about right. June 1, you hear used a lot around here as a planting date for any of the sorghum hybrids. And you could plant them later as long as you got got a rainfall to carry them.
But the big thing on that, we don't want to get them too tall, right?
Right. It's like anything, right? Any of these forages, you could equate, in this case, height maybe with maturity, right? You don't want them to get too over mature, or you're going to lose a bunch of nutritive value out of those.
Or start going in reproduction.
Yeah.
Start throwing a head up. We know you've waited long enough or too long.
That's right. But then you got to be careful. You mentioned height, and so I'll bring in the old rule of thumb with some of these sorghum Sudan hybrids, right? They do have the potential to produce prussic acid, right? And so with that, we want to make sure that we're not grazing them when they're too mature, because there's a risk of toxicity when they're too mature as well. So, you hear different things out there, whether they're minimum grazing height of 18 inches or 24 inches to get out of that window of the prussic acid risk.
All right. But one of the things that surprised me one time is when I looked at the forage quality, ran it through the NIR, or the labs, and I compared it to the tall fescue. I thought, oh my gosh, these warm season grasses aren't near as good as the tall fescue was, quality wise. Was that a good observation, or am I comparing apples to oranges here?
Well, there's a little bit of apples and oranges. You mentioned the NIR,
right? Okay, yeah. Threw that acronym out.
Yeah, so the NIR is only as good as the calibration that you use in a lot of ways, and so if you're not making your own calibration with your own plant material and things, you can run into some. Well,
these are the ones that we send off to a lab.
Sure, but what calibrations are they using?
Sure.
Right. If you send a forage out that doesn't have a lot of data behind it to a lab, so like sun hemp, for example, right, relatively novel. What calibration curve are they going to use to measure the nutritive value of sun hemp using an NIR? Right? Are there a lot of data behind that calibration? So some of those things you got to kind of look at a little bit more closely.
So if we're grazing year round, for example, so that 90 days that we talked about last time that we're grazing, that we're probably grazing stockpiled, that data could be a little bit deceiving too, couldn't it? Because how many times have we ran January sorghums out there or January forage quality wise?
Yeah, I think if you've got any question whatsoever about the forage, if it's an atypical variety, if it's an atypical time, your best bet is to request a wet chemistry analysis on it to actually directly measure acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, crude protein, etc. Right? So these NIRs, they were originally developed to determine the starch content of corn.
Really? And we've just expanded that.
And it was a great technique, but it was also originally developed with a very homogeneous product, right? And it might have even been wheat, actually, was the first deployment of NIR. It was either wheat or corn, but in the late 60s. And we've just expanded the use of it over time. A lot of these calibrations are proprietary to these companies, so we don't know what goes into their calibration equations, 1. 2, we also don't know which calibration equation they're going to apply to our forage. So if we've mislabeled our forage or not been descriptive enough, they might just throw it into a general bin. And I'll tell you, there are some forage tests that I receive each year that I know are done incorrectly because they were done via NIR. Now, why do people use NIR? It's non-destructive. It's faster for the lab to do it, so they generally will offer it at a discount relative to wet chemistry. But if you're getting into any atypical situation or atypical forage, it needs to be, and I would even go so far as to say mixed forage. I would trust NIR for alfalfa. Alfalfa is alfalfa, right? I don't know that I would trust NIR as much for a mixed forage stand. I think that's where we could see some differences and discrepancies.
Or if I say I have a tall fescue red clover pasture out there, right?
Yeah,
they may be really 95% tall fescue, so I've thrown their curve off.
Exactly. Yeah. So if in doubt, wet chemistry.
Yeah.
And generally, I tell people to use wet chemistry because it seems like anymore the lab's not any faster getting NIR results back than they are wet chem, and it's to save $5 a sample.
I was going to say I've ran some wet chem because they didn't have the curves.
Yeah.
And it is just as quick and costs a few more dollars.
Yep.
And that data is probably, like you say, a bit more accurate.
Because going back to the original point, so I do hear this pretty commonly from producers that the native warm season grasses, warm season annuals, seem to test more poorly than what they might feed. And so I've had to really spend a fair bit of time in the kind of fiber chemistry world thinking about this. Now, there's 2 points to make, though. Have we overestimated the nutritive value of fescue historically, or are we underestimating the value of these native warm season grasses? And I think there's really evidence for both of those. And so, again, these laboratory analyses, they're our best guess at what the nutritive value of that feed stuff is, but really the cow is going to be the one that tells us, right? So
just looking at her.
Looking at her. Yeah. Plus, they also don't factor in how much of that feed she's eating. Mm-hmm. I could give, right? So like you and I, we could meet our daily nutrient requirements eating 2 pounds of Snickers bars a day, right? Well, not even 2 pounds. It would be like 0.2 of a pound of Snickers bars a day. But right, if you eat 5 bites of food a day, it doesn't matter how nutrient dense it's going to be. Your blood sugar is going to do this. You're going to be hangry, right? Versus having 3 balanced meals. It's the same deal with cattle, right? So if we give them a handful of really good quality feed, they're going to still express hunger and act aggressive for feed because their gut is empty by and large. That's what's happening right now in March. All of these cows that are body condition score 4, rough hair coat, out on green grass, nursing young calves, they're losing body weight right now. They're not gaining. But it's not because the nutritive value of the feed is poor. It's because there's not enough feed out there for them.
Well, like you said last time, they're only going to take so many bites a day. Mm-hmm. And there's not a lot to bite.
Yep.
They're not getting in there enough, even though it's good.
Exactly.
They're not getting very much in there. And same thing in the summertime, we got to make sure we have, like one of the things I thought about when we oversee, let's say we had Korean Lespedeza, if it's not very much biomass out there, they're not getting a lot, are they? Even though it's good stuff.
That's right. I mean, and really with Lespedeza, it's a complement to whatever is there, right? It's not meant to be, it doesn't produce enough to be everything that's on the plate, right?
So could we manage then, we have our pastures that we want to improve in the summer, but we could also just have some fields that we're dedicated to annual crops. Could we do that too?
You could do that. For sure, you could do that.
And your sorghums could come into play and that sort of thing.
That's right.
And we just manage that. And even you could stockpile going into the winter on that too, couldn't you? Yeah,
and you bring up a good point with stockpile. I mean, having a place to go in the summertime to give your perennial cool season pasture some rest is going to extend your grazing season in more than one way. It's going to extend your grazing season in the summertime because you're going to a place where you've got adequate forage availability, and they're going to graze that. You're also extending your grazing season by allowing that cool season perennial grass to rest. It's going to be much better able to stockpile for fall grazing going into the winter if it's had some rest, because that old adage, it takes grass to grow grass, that's real, right? But if we stay on that fescue pasture all summer long and we're beating it up, and then we try to give it a break there at the end, in August or something to start stockpiling, it's just trying to survive at that point, right? It's not going to grow much biomass. It's not going to give you what you're going to need to carry you for very long at all into the wintertime. And so that, there's multiple ways that these warm seasons can help us out.
Can we even plant our native warm season grasses into our tall fescue, into our cool season grasses?
Native warm season grasses?
Right. Could you have a switchgrass tall fescue mix? Does that work? I've heard some noise about that.
There is some noise out there about that. I'd say you can do that. We actually have an example of it down at one of our farms, a Wordak farm, where we've got big blue stem and Indian grass and tall fescue planted in the same acres, and we're trying to understand how well that works. We're getting, I can't quote the data because I don't have it off the top of my head, but the number of grazing days, the carrying capacity that we have on that system is really impressive. But we've just been doing that for 2 years, so we want to carry it a little bit longer term before we start really talking about it. But
sure,
yeah, absolutely, those plants are working well together. It all comes down to how you manage them, right? But what you see is you've got perennial cool season grazing in the spring, and then as that competition as the competition from that component decreases, you've got the native warm seasons that are coming on, and you've got that to graze through the summer, and then the cool seasons are coming back in the fall. Now, it does require some rotational grazing. It does require some rest for both components for that system to work, but it's working pretty well.
I think what we're hearing a lot is that we need to manage our whole system to really be thinking about what I want spring, summer, and fall, and even into those 90 days of traditional hay feeding that we could be stockpiling.
Well, and let's even take this conversation back to tall fescue, right? So tall fescue was developed in the 30s and released in the 50s, right, as a replacement for Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, that didn't withstand continuous grazing, chronic overstocking, right? But fescue does. And we have come to see fescue like the terminator of this forage system that just is the unbeatable thing, because it's the only thing, it's the last man standing with traditional, conventional management, right? But, I think what Dr. Nauman is illustrating here with the mixed stand of warm and cool season grasses is that that's not always the case if you change the management, right? So fescue shades out a lot of competition, right? When it gets a really dense thatch layer and then a really dense canopy, when it's essentially a monoculture, right? It crowds out competition. But if you weaken the stand of fescue any, then you open that canopy back up and you let other grasses proliferate. Now, legumes for that matter, absolutely right. And so what I would say as a non-forage agronomist, if you're going to make a system like that work long term, you've got to think about when you're timing your defoliation events, right? And so I would tell you that if I wanted to manage that system for native warm season grasses, I'd burn it in April once the fescue has gotten up. Every year, I would burn it until I've knocked the fescue back. Conversely, if I mistimed my fire by 30 days and burned in early March instead, I'm just going to open up the canopy for fescue to get really thick and maybe potentially shade out the native warm season grasses. Fire is no different than grazing, is no different than haying. Those are all defoliation events. It's changing the timing to optimize the system.
All right. So we talk about stocking rates. So how do we figure that out? I mean, how do we figure that?
Well, this is a great question. I mean, stocking rates, we have to remind everybody that is a management decision, right? We as land managers, we decide how many animals we're going to put out there. We use carrying capacity is what we need to figure out, right? And not exceed that for sure. So that's the key, right? And you have to know something about your system to be able to accurately calculate carrying capacity. I mean, you need to know what is your annual forage production on average, right? You need to know how many days do I want to graze, and what we've said already here is we should be planning on 365 if we have a year-round enterprise, right? So if you're in cow-calf, budget 365-day grazing period, right? If you're running stockers, then it depends on your system, right? How many days you're gonna carry those, right? So your carrying capacity depends a lot on that grazing period. You need to know what your average utilization is going to be. Okay, so that's a function of your management, right? Am I going to practice take half, leave half, for example? So I'll have a 50% utilization over the whole system for the 365 days. And you need to know what the average intake is of your animal, right? So kind and class of animal matters. A lot of times you'll see folks use, with cattle anyway, if cow-calf operation, they'll take a 3% of body weight, for example, because sometimes they're going to be lactating, but not always, right? And so
2% just normal, but 3% lactating. Is that how it is?
Yeah, 2.5%, maybe more normal. But there's a range there. Is the point? You probably want to live in the average or live a little bit higher to give yourself a little bit of a buffer, right? But you have to know some things about the whole system to determine the carrying capacity.
And you were saying that our carrying capacity of tall fescue probably is not as much as we think that it is.
Probably not. I mean, if you did a Google search online pretty quickly of what is the average carrying capacity in Missouri or the typical stocking rate, something like that, you'll hear there's usually a range out there. But 2 acres to the pair, maybe. Sometimes you see 3 acres to the pair. And we've been working on a couple of farms here lately where we're actually going out and we're physically measuring all of these things and putting the pencil to paper. And it's coming out a lot closer to 5 acres to the pair.
For year round.
For year round, 365 days. Right. Wow. And this is average management.
There's also an animal component to this, though. The size of the cow will determine her intake. And we have heard from on high for years that we need better feedlot cattle, right? We're the white tablecloth beef producer. We have marketed to producers that maximizing wean weight is the key to maximizing revenue on the farm. All of this marketing that you've heard has translated to the cow-calf producers of making genetic selection decisions for larger females. We've made genetic selection decisions for larger females that require more feed. And so now with the modern 1,500-pound cow, she takes 40% more feed than the classical 1,000-pound cow that the animal unit system was established on 40 to 50 years ago. I would argue, and this is a hot take for Tim's Take podcast, we need to reclassify the animal unit system based on a 1,500-pound cow, not a 1,000-pound cow. Now that totally changes the whole equation, though, because right. I mean,
that's why I went from 2.5 to 5.
That's a piece of it, right? Yeah. So I think one piece of it is that maybe fescue is less productive than we think it is in terms of forage production per acre per year. The second part, though, is that our cows eat more feed than they used to, right? I mean, it would not be uncommon for me to budget 6 to 7 tons of forage per cow per year if I was going to graze 365 days a year. And that's a modern cow, whereas that budget not that long ago was 4 to 5 tons of forage per acre per cow.
But we also got to think about the quality of that. You know, we started out this conversation about NIR and getting that quality, but that makes a difference too. We got energy, we got protein, and that's going to depend on the stage of her growth or the stocker's growth.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, I mean, even going back to that, like if I had my druthers in a tall fescue system, I was going to run cows on, I'd calve in April. And that is another blazing hot take for this podcast. But what you're doing is you're trying to calve in sync with nature, and you're trying to time forage quality with peak nutrient requirements in a cow. That's a principle that works extremely well in other states, and that folks that are on the progressive side of cattle production are doing, and they're reducing their inputs because they've synced their calving season with their forage growth curve. I think we could do the same thing in Missouri, but there's a lot of reluctance to do it. It's interesting, you know, imagine, and this is a graphic that I use to draw for shock and awe in extension presentations, but imagine a little baby newborn calf just birthed from mama, still wet, being born on 6 inches of snow, versus that same calf being born in green grass with some wildflowers. I mean, that's the simple piece of this whole deal. And so, you know, synchronizing your forage production system and the nutrient cycle of the cows is an important piece, because a cow's peak nutrient requirements will be roughly 60% greater than her nutrient requirements when she's a non-lactating early gestation, 1st to 2nd trimester gestation female. So there's big swings in nutrient requirements over the course of a year.
To jump on that April calving, I mean, so your peak lactation is in, if we're just going to use averages, we're going to say June, right? Yep. And so that makes a great case for native warm season grasses to be part of your grazing system, right? Because they're really coming on in May. You can start grazing them right around the beginning of June. And we've got some data where we showed that calves coming off of a system that graze tall fescue in the spring and then native warm season grasses all summer long had considerably greater weaning weights than calves that were coming off of the year-round typical fescue grazing system. So that's when you heavier weaning weights, that's money in the bank, right?
And with native warm season grasses, it can really put some growth on. Do we really have to watch it even closer to make sure we keep it in that vegetative size where we have that good quality?
Absolutely. I mean, you want to keep it's not unique to native grasses. It's not unique to introduced grasses. If you want good nutritive value for growing class animals, then keep it vegetative.
Well, in our last one, we talked about tall fescue harvest, and we want to get it done in May, for example, before it hits reproduction. But I hear a lot of producers say, yeah, but those stems is where I get all my yield from. A lot of my yield, but the quality goes down a lot more than that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's what do you want? You want a whole bunch of cardboard, or do you want a little bit less of steak, right? I mean,
exactly.
It's that's the way I look at it.
And really tall fescue once you get past mid-June it's pretty
well, that's
cardboard.
That's where farmers miss, though, right? So if they wait to take their first cutting of fescue hay until after the 4th of July, you're talking about 50 TDN, 6 to 8% crude protein, tall fescue. TDN's total digestible nutrients, measure of energy. That's insufficient to meet the energy needs of even the non-lactating, early gestation, pregnant female who has the lowest nutrient requirements. And so to avoid body condition score loss in that animal, you have to supplement on top of it. And so I would question, if you have to go back and spend 40 cents per cow per day and supplement on top of the hay you made, would you have been money ahead to just make better hay in the first place?
Because what she needs, like 61 or 2
so peak,
TDN?
Yeah, so TDN, anytime TDN's below 55, it's not going to meet the nutrient requirements of any classic cow. Right. And lactating cows, we generally think of above 60, 62, maybe 63. I've used the rule of thumb 55, 60, 65 in the past to illustrate it as just a rule of thumb. I think that 65 is too high for lactating cows. So 55 would be for gestating cows, 60 would be for late gestation, 65 for lactating. But I think that's too high. It's because I see in practice where lactating cows on 60, 62 TDN feed will maintain body condition, even though they're making 20 to 30 pounds of milk for that calf each day.
I always think the bigger the better.
Yeah.
I've always been disappointed when I only have 60 TD,
yeah.
And I want more, but that's not bad.
Now, if your forage analysis TDN starts with a 6, you've won.
And that's energy. That gives you the energy, but now you need protein on that too, don't you?
Well, so
just depending.
I have been trying for 8 years now to de-emphasize protein and forage quality, because there are a lot of farmers in Missouri that equate forage quality with the crude protein concentration. But I see, so out west, what's interesting, you talk about prairie hay in Kansas. I see a lot of prairie hay that's 57 TDN, 3.5% crude protein. That forage is low in crude protein. Yes. Conversely, I see fescue hay in Missouri that's 8% crude protein, 9% crude protein, 48 TDN. Energy is our most limiting nutrient in this forage system by a large margin. Yet we have a lot of popular press articles that are written for a national audience that equate forage quality with protein. That is true in warm season forage systems, but is not true in cool season forage systems.
Yeah, because I've heard others say that energy is our most expensive thing to have to purchase. So if we can grow energy, we're in good shape. So our winter grazing, high in energy is good.
Yep.
Our sorghums and such. It's just that we need that more protein, possibly. Harley, now you have a publication on maximizing our summer production.
Yeah, this is just, I grabbed a few publications off of MU Extension website. Just thought we might reference some of those if we needed to. But we've got one here that's maximizing summer grazing. It's a guide to warm season forage management in Missouri. That's something that anybody could Google that and look up. And it's got decent information in there about some of the forage options. It talks about forage yields, forage quality, seeding rates on some of these forages, seeding dates, some of those things.
These ones that they were talking about, like the summer ones.
Yep. Great. Selecting, talks a little bit about selecting the right forages for Missouri. So it's pretty specific. Got information in there on Bermuda grass, but also some native grasses, crabgrass as well. So there are various things in there. It's pretty useful. Weed management, preparing for drought, extreme weather, right? All the things that we kind of need to be thinking about at this time so that we have a plan in place. should we run into those kinds of situations.
All right. Well, Eric, anything else that you want to conclude with on your on the livestock end?
Hay is the devil.
Hay is the devil. But, I think several of them will say that we need to have some, just in case we get these ice storms that come up or these big snows where they can't graze.
But you need to be honest about it. You're describing an insurance policy.
Right.
I'm not opposed to hay as an insurance policy, but when it infiltrates our normal annual management plan, that's when our feed bill goes up. That's when we have a less productive cow-calf operation, because if a quarter of the feed that we feed to a beef cow in a year costs 3 times what it should, I mean, that's your profit margin right there. There's that cash flow that I mentioned earlier, right? So
what would I do now to even think about next fall and winter? Do I need to start planning in the early summer, spring, like what I'm going to have going into November, December, January, February that I may need to have out in the field? Sorghums are part of that, I would think, or a stockpile tall fescue is part of that. And
yeah, it's kind of all of the above, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's what is your plan to minimize your need for stored forages in your grazing system, and that's, again, we'll go back to the basics, right? What is your carrying capacity, and then what is your stocking rate relative to your carrying capacity? Are you stocked appropriately to graze for 365, and start there, and then start thinking about how do I get more grazing days. Right, then you can start thinking about some of these other forage amendments to your system.
Do we have an extension publication on 365 grazing yet?
No,
but we need that, don't we? That's really where we're going with a lot of this.
I do want to put one plug in. So you need to take a stock of the resources that you potentially have at your disposal, because particularly if you're in northern Missouri, the crop residue availability, in particular corn stalks, right? So Nebraska, it's very common for cows to get shipped out to corn stalks in November and get 60, 90 days of additional grazing simply by harvesting the aftermath of a completely different production practice, right? And I know that farmers are maybe a little bit more reluctant to do that here, and that we've lost a lot of our fence and water infrastructure to do so. But, those resources don't just necessarily have to come off of your farm as well, right?
Like your neighbor, you could lease that land for the
absolutely.
Winter. And I think you once said for every 100 bushels of corn, you have 100 cow days per acre.
Correct.
Out there. So we can get quite a bit. And if you throw a cover crop, a winter wheat or something out there, you can really get some very high.
Yeah. So
quality.
I wouldn't try to background calves on corn stalks, right? There's low protein, low energy. The highest and best use of corn stalks by themselves is that non-lactating early gestation pregnant female with the low nutrient requirements. If those covers become vital, though, if you're trying to add weight to those cows, if you're trying to background calves, if you're trying to put any kind of weight on any class of cattle, right? The corn stalk model is more about maintaining body weight, rather than gaining.
But then again, our cover crops, our wheat can be implemented with this and really give us some nice.
Absolutely.
All right. Anything else, Harley, before we sign off?
No, I think we're good.
All right. Well, thank you all. This is it for Tim's Take. And we had 2 great guests here, and we'll continue with these hot topics that Eric brought up. We'll see you next time.